Hello, everybody. Right now, I'd like to talk to you about Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and Israel, Ukraine, Russia, and China, and how all of these crazy countries and all the crap that's going on is connected. Now, I remember when I was a little younger and I was trying to get into politics to understand what was going on in the world, I started looking into countries to see why we have to care about them. At least that's the approach I had. I didn't really understand why our foreign policy was the way it was. So, I'm going to go ahead and lay down some things for you. How is all this crap connected to each other? How is Russia, China, the Ukraine, Israel, Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba all connected? Let's go ahead and start. I'm going to do my best, so I'll keep it simple, so follow along. It sounds kind of crazy. All right. Let's start in our own backyard, Venezuela, Cuba. Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, who was a former bus driver turned loyalist to Hugo Chavez and then took over as president. Now, Venezuela actually had clean elections. Now, getting ballot access was a little difficult, but they had cleaner elections. Although they were still an authoritarian government, whoever they decided to let on those elections, they generally listened to them. It's just that what happened was the government forces just made sure that they got the outcomes they wanted. Nicolas Maduro basically lost his last election. So that's out the window now, too. So this idea that they get to tell the world that they have all these free and these all clean elections, that's kind of done. So their little talking points over. We replaced Nicolas Maduro with basically just somebody who's going to do our bidding. We replaced the head of the snake with a different head of a snake, with the same reactionaries running it, the same incompetent little morons sitting around there taking bribes and stealing from their own people and governments, except there's one little key difference. They stopped the oil exports to China, and they stopped them to Cuba. That's two problems. Let's go with China. Although that's a complex issue, it's easier to explain. Cuba is responsible for 4% of China's imports when it comes to oil. 4%. That's something they can get over, and by the time this video has been even recorded, and by the time it's released, probably already figured it out, but it's not nothing. It's difficult. So the idea, it's just under 1 out of 20 barrels they get from Cuba, and they get from Venezuela. It's just gone now. Now, how that's connected to everything else is China is considering invading Taiwan, which is another ally of ours, and I'm not going to get into that one in this video. But one of the things that they're doing in the Ukraine, and at least in the war, is they're using a lot of the Uyghurs, which were Muslims, that the regime actually basically kidnapped and put into camps, and they're forcing them to make labor and to actually make drone parts. And they're sending those to Russia, and then a lot of those drones are being sent to the Ukrainians. And they're sent against the Ukrainian forces on behalf of the Russian Federation. So there's that. China's also been a strategic pretty much enemy of ours since World War II. They're always ran by idiots. Now, for a while in the 2000s and the late 90s, and up until these past 6-7 years, that it came to a grinding halt, we made some economic deals with us that at least some people got to make money off of. But basically this. We went after Venezuela so we could screw over the Chinese. And if we screw over the Chinese, it screws over Russia, and it screws over the war in the Ukraine. Okay, back to Cuba. Cuba this is something a lot of people really don't know about. And they wouldn't expect this because it's such a poor country. But Cuba has more foreign agents in the United States than any other country. Their biggest bargaining chip is they get to do surveillance on the United States government on the ground. It's their biggest bargaining chip that they have. Also, Cuba, which you probably already know, is an authoritarian government. And even with the imports coming in, they can't govern the place. It's basically a mafia state with non-state actors, a competent government, and of course the Castros, even though they're not really in power, they still kind of have enough of a hand and influence in it so at least they don't get arrested down the road. And unfortunately, the Castros and all their little stalking heads, they're morons. So there's a nasty humanitarian crisis in Cuba right now because there's reports that there's sometimes only 3 hours of the day that they can provide electricity and they can provide basic services. The bad news with that is Cuban people are good people. They deserve better than what they're getting, and they're not going to get anything different. And unfortunately, they have a reactionary government that puts themselves in front of them and the people are going to pay for it. And I don't like that, and I don't want that. It may very well cause a humanitarian crisis that leads to more immigration, which is, of course. But basically, bringing down the Cuban government a peg like this, somebody is going to fill the void, and it's going to be usually non-state actors. So do I think that this is worth it? No. I think the long-term damage and the instability in the region is actually going to cause more problems than we already do. But of course, I'm just forecasting. We'll really never know until the future comes. So Venezuela exports to China and to Cuba. These are two strategic, really enemies of ours that have been put in their place a little bit. However, that doesn't mean our security budgets get to dry up. So let's go ahead and move on. Said Iran, Israel. Now, what does Iran and Israel have to do with this? Right? So I'll go ahead and get into that now. Iran and Israel have been hating each other my whole life. And since actually the Iranian's regime became authoritarian in 1979 and the rise of the Ayatollahs. I don't like calling them the Ayatollahs because they're not Ayatollahs. They just use the name and flaunt their religion and pretend to be Ayatollahs when in fact they're just a bunch of reactionary politicians. But here they are. The big thing with those two countries is this. Their biggest enemy is pretty much each other. But they don't have the capabilities of actually getting their forces to the other country. So right now, we're bombing them. We're bombing the Iranians with the Israelis. We're taking out a lot of their military infrastructure. One of the reasons I don't think that this war is going to last is because if you really wanted to mess with the Iranians, you can go to Karg Island, which is responsible for roughly 90% of their oil exports. You could just drop a couple bombs on that place and they're done, and the whole country's screwed. It's not very defensible, and they don't have the resources to defend it even if they wanted to. In other words, Iran's not a bully. Iran's somebody that you could basically just drop a couple bombs on one area and the whole thing collapses. So when you're actually just bombing military infrastructure, that's how I know they're not going to go after anybody. And that's how you know too. Because if they really wanted to collapse that place, a country doesn't even need to do it. Honestly, a couple non-state actors and terrorist types could probably pull that off. But as far as Israel is going to go, Israel in these past couple of years has been taking a dump on the Iranians. And it's kind of a good thing. Even though I don't really like what they're doing in Palestine, and they're a bunch of reactionaries who want to become an authoritarian government, and it's ran by a bunch of conservatives that think they're special, just like they are all over the world. But the Israeli government has been doing a number against Hezbollah with that pager bombing that actually recently happened. That destroyed the middlemen between the political leadership of Hezbollah and the ground soldiers. In other words, it took away their capabilities of coordinating attacks in a very rapid manner. They really reduced Hezbollah to just a bunch of brainless street thugs with do-nothing politicians running them. And since they're not just a terrorist group anymore, they merged with the government of Lebanon, now they have to actually worry about governing. And since they can't, they're actually losing on every front. They have to rebuild while the country that they're supposed to govern, they don't have the capability of governing. And Hezbollah, before they merged in with the government and became government officials, just so you know, is responsible for killing more Americans than any other terrorist group. It was by far. And some of you younger people may not know this. Back in the 2000s when we were going to war with Iraq and Afghanistan, Hezbollah was offering $10,000 to people that would deliver them people with special forces experience from the West. No joke. A lot of them didn't get caught by them, some of them did. And what I mean by some of them did, they got tortured really badly until they told the information that they were going to tell. And I will tell you this, on TV and in real life is not the same thing. The torture they will put them through is just awful. And most of the time they talk. Not all the time, but a lot of the times they do. So this is a pretty scary thing. They're literally responsible for killing and torturing American service members over a long period of time. Now that pager bombing, you may not like it. And I may not like the fact that they're blowing up in public squares either. But Hezbollah is a monster that needed to be dealt with, and they're no longer a monster. Let's go to the north. What did Israel do in Syria? Syria, the Assad government, was also in part of an alliance with Hezbollah and also with Iran. Once again, because Iran can't get their forces over towards Israel because they're an occupying force. In other words, they're there just to keep the regime in power. They dabble in internal security here and there, but for the most part, they can't really do anything but fight unarmed civilians. Although, the Iranian people themselves are some of the smartest people in the world. It's very common for people to speak 3-4 languages. It's very common for people to have bachelor's degrees. In other words, this is one of the most educated populations in the planet. They're multicultural. They speak multiple languages. And their English accents that they speak with are very similar to a Nebraskan accent, to the point where they could walk up into this country and everyone will assume they're supposed to be here. However, though, in fairness, the Iranian people themselves are great. I love them. I think they're awesome. They have so much in common with Western ideals, but of course their government just doesn't. Back to the Assad regime. Assad was actually an alliance with the Iranians, and they would actually use their strategic position to make trouble for the West and Western allies, like in Israel. And since Assad fell in a civil war, it did a couple things. The alliance between Israel and Syria is different. They don't have influence on the main government to do their bidding, and neither does the Russian government. Now, the Russian government had a navy base in there, and I think they're still trying to evacuate. It's going to take a lot of resources to get them out of there. So the Russian government is really no longer having any influence directly next to Syria either. So Russia is getting brought down a notch. Iran is getting brought down a notch. Hezbollah got brought down a notch, and the Assad regime has been done. So I get it. When you put all this stuff together, taking a dump on the Iranians, this is the time to do it. But of course, you have to have this age-old question. If you take a dump on the government, who's going to fill the void? Usually, it's just going to be more reactionary type of politicians. So there's that. So what else we got? Right? It's less complicated than that? No? Yes? Here's the deal with all of this stuff. The reason why our foreign policy is so complicated is because foreign policy itself is complicated. Whether we like it or not, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea are going to basically use the entire globe as a proxy war against the West. And they have been doing it, and they will continue to do it. And even though I do appreciate a lot of the left-wing types that are out here calling out the Trump regime for making mistakes, a lot of times you're just magnifying the bad parts of our policy just to tag it onto Trump. When unfortunately, now as much as I don't like the Trump administration, this is something I can pretty much see any president that I've ever had in my entire life do. You got to take a dump on your enemies, and you got to put yourself in the position of the president. Just take away the fact that you don't like him, because I don't. You are responsible for the safety of Americans. A country that has funded terrorist groups that kill your soldiers, they fought regimes and non-state actors that literally fight your soldiers, that kidnap your citizens, kill your citizens. They provide rockets to the Houthis that were shooting rockets at civilian ships in the Red Sea. That's another one too. And you have a chance to bring them down a notch. Now, you could do it and create more instability, but if you don't do it, they're going to take that stability and point it at your citizens. So it's something that, politically speaking, it's a lose-lose all around. So you just got to make a decision. So here's the deal. And I know I got a comment that nobody likes me saying, here's the deal. So I'm going to do it again. Here's the deal. These people are going to have to be our enemies. They're always going to be our enemies. Even if we do fully become authoritarian, they're going to be our enemies still. Because no matter what you do in Cuba, no matter what you do in Venezuela, no matter what you do in Iran, no matter what you do in Russia, no matter what you do in China, there is not enough resources in that country to maintain a stable democracy where they're going to actually get competent people in power. And look at our country. We do have the resources to actually maintain a healthy democracy and put competent people in power, and the populace just doesn't feel like it. Now, how is this all connected to Russia and the Ukraine war? Russia, China, Iran, all the non-state actors that I mentioned, all the reactionary countries that I mentioned are all part of the same alliance. If we can absolutely defeat them, When I say we, what I actually meant is the Ukrainian army actually defeat the Russians in their war, it'll bring down that entire alliance down a notch. If the Russians aren't allowed to make trouble, well, of course they'll just rebuild. But if they can't make trouble and they don't have the resources to do it, the Russian mob won't be as powerful. And that's a huge problem all across the world. Funding reactionary groups all across the globe, that money will start drying up. The Uyghurs in China, which are basically just in re-education camps that are building drone parts, more of a magnifying glass could be shined on that human rights violation. And all these little incompetent morons that are in power, these little senile just idiots that don't know what they're doing other than arresting and going after their political enemies, will actually have to think their way out of a problem, and they can't do it. So thank you for tuning in. This isn't a video where I could tell you what's going to happen, or I did forecast it a little bit, or this is just kind of letting you know what's going on the best I can. Because a lot of the right wing is going to just go ahead and highlight the good stuff that I just said. And say, oh, Trump's a genius. No, he's not a genius. He's a moron. And a lot of the left wingers are just going to highlight the bad parts of what I just said because Trump's a moron. Even though he's a moron, this is basic stuff. Now, would have a different Kamala Harris would have handled it differently? I don't know, probably, maybe. But since we didn't elect her, we have to deal with this guy. Thanks for listening. Do me a favor, like and subscribe for more content. I'll do my best to just cut through the BS to give it to you straight. Not always right, but I always try to be. Have yourselves a good one.